That makes sense. Go everyone. Have fun.
Thank you, Bill.
Oh, yeah. Okay, guys, just make sure, go ahead and do it now. Can you guys make sure, if you want to take a picture, take a shot right now when you kind of sit there, because when the round starts, no phones can come out. So when the round starts, phones should not be out, okay? And we'll ask that you guys don't talk, whisper. I will just pay attention. And if you've got to run up and go use the bathroom, please wait till a speech finishes before you get up and move around, because it does cause a commotion. It could distract the debaters, okay? And we'll thank you for that. Thank you for coming and supporting, and thank you for the great job you guys have all done. Whichever event you were in, thank you so much for your hard work and practice. And good job, all of you. Go ahead and do it so I can write that. Welcome to the debate final, the ACS Amman's inaugural Forensics and Debate Tournament. And we have our two finalist teams from ACS Amman, Jonathan and Leanne, and from OIS,
Akshan and Roshan.
congratulations on making the final. Okay, so we're going to ask OIS to call it in the air. There's heads, there's tails. Who's going to call it for you guys? Okay, call it in the air, sir.
Tails.
Tails is the call. It is tails. So OIS wants to be kind. You guys want to speak first or second? First. Okay, can you guys move over here again? You guys move over there. Thank you very much. And for the first speaker, sit to the inside. And for the first speaker, for your side, sit to the inside. Debaters, are you ready? Okay, let's commence.
You guys ready? Partner? My partner and I are here today to make the strongest affirmative case that NGOs are far more effective than governments at improving the lives of disadvantaged people. Some definitions for the argument are for disadvantaged, quote, unable to attain basic conditions and resources such as civil rights, shelter, adequate education, and medical care. Improve as, quote, to enhance in value or quality, make better. Both of those are provided by Merriam-Webster. And for specificity revolving around the resolution, an NGO is a nonprofit organization that operates independently of any government, typically one whose purpose is to address a social or political issue. A government is a people with the authority to govern a country or state, and on balance is when all factors are taken into consideration. Our points include NGOs providing healthcare and disaster relief with regard specifically to the 2010 Haiti earthquake and vaccinations in Africa, and child marriage with evidence from South Asia. We believe that NGOs pick up the slack that governments leave behind, as NGOs are more effective than governments. Contention 1 I want to make is on healthcare. Governments, particularly in Africa, where the disadvantaged people are in far greater need of assistance than those in first world countries, fail to provide healthcare effectively onto enough of the population. According to the AIDNA International, there's only one doctor per 2,000 people in Nigeria, which has more doctors per person than most of its African neighbors, the exception being South Africa. Stanford is quoted as saying that fewer than 50% of Africans have access to modern healthcare facilities. The Gates Foundation, famous for its work in vaccinations, does a majority of its work in distributions through the GAVI Alliance. Since 2000, the GAVI Alliance has vaccinated over 760 million children, preventing over an estimated 13 million deaths. My second contention is human rights, specifically child marriage, a practice common in poor and rural areas in South Asia. UNICEF reports that child marriage is in fact a violation of human rights. Quote, child marriage is a violation of human rights. It compromises the development of girls and boys. All these factors make it impossible to break the vicious circle of poverty, particularly for girls, says Osama Bugali, a UN representative. In 2013, the UN Human Rights Council stated that between 2011 and 2020, more than 140 million girls will be married off, oftentimes for financial reasons, before their 18th birthday. Over half of these child marriages occur in South Asia. Child marriage has been illegal in India since 1929, says National Geographic. Despite the fact that this law has been in place for a long time, the prevalence indicates the government is either unwilling or unable to stop the crisis. Again, this is where an NGO steps in. In Pakistan, they successfully lobbied for the legal marriage age to be raised from 16 to 18 for girls. And despite the lack of available statistics, momentum towards ending child marriage is growing quickly. My third contention is disaster relief, for which I will be providing information from the infamous 2010 Haiti earthquake. Medium.com is quoted as saying that NGOs remain the main players in disaster relief around the globe, I stress, not governments. This is because NGOs provide more effective relief, they provide it faster and without hesitation, and can appeal to the global community for funding on demand, something a government with a fixed budget cannot do. According to worldvision.org, over 3 million people were affected by the earthquake in Haiti. That's almost as many as the population of Amman. Half the affected population became internally displaced. There were 250,000 deaths and 300,000 injuries. CS Monitor reported that the government did nothing for 4 days. While they did nothing, NGOs sprung into action. In the 12 months following the natural disaster, Habitat for Humanity UK alone helped over 250,000 people with infrastructure, medical aid, and more. To conclude, I must affirm that indeed, NGOs are more effective than governments at providing aid to the most disadvantaged people through relief for unforeseen disasters, such as the Haiti earthquake, healthcare in Africa and rural Africa, and the defense of civil and human rights in the case of defending women's and children's rights not to be married before their 18th birthday. Thank you.
Wait, one second. Could you stop?
Good afternoon, Honorable Judge. Today we'll be negating the resolution that on balance, non-governmental organizations are more effective than the government at improving the lives of disadvantaged. And we'll be proving that governments can be equally as effective as an NGO or more effective than the NGO. And we would like to start off with the rebuttals. The con mentioned various statistics the con provided various statistics in their first example. However, they did not provide what correlation the statistics have about the limited access and prove as to how NGOs are better than governments with these statistics that they provided. Secondly, they talked about child marriage and they mentioned an example about child marriage and a legislative change and NGOs lobbying in Pakistan. However, how do we know that NGOs were the sole reason for this legislative change and that there was no government collaboration with the NGOs to bring about a legislative change, which would in fact affirm that governments can work equally as effective as non-governmental organizations? Secondly, they talked about disaster relief, and but they did not mention the NGOs that provided this relief. They did not mention how they provided this relief or what exact relief they provided. And secondly, they did not tell us the number of people that were disadvantaged according to their definition in the Haitian 2010 earthquake. Because everyone must have been affected, but we do not know how many disadvantaged people were affected and how many disadvantaged people were impacted by the actions of these NGOs. And secondly, and lastly, they stated that the government did not do anything for 4 days, but they did not specify whether or not the government did anything after those 4 days. So this leads us to believe that maybe or maybe not the government could have intervened in the Haitian earthquake disaster relief programs, and they could have done an effective job, as effective as non-governmental organizations in the disaster relief of Haiti. Sorry. Now the con would like to bring up its first example based on that governments are more effective in handling disease prevention and eradication for disadvantaged than NGOs. This can be seen in the CDC's Center, which is the Center for Disease Control and Prevention's response to the West African Ebola outbreak. In the year 2014, the regions of Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia saw the outbreak of a virus epidemic called Ebola. In 2014, there were 18,000 cases of infection and 6,400 deaths in the three countries, according to a December 2014 UNDP report. However, the CDC, which is an American public health institute, activated its emergency operations in July to respond to the growing epidemic as it started to spread to other regions in Africa. During the course of the response, the CDC trained 24,655 healthcare workers in West Africa, with over 24 state-of-the-art laboratories to contain the epidemic outbreak, according to an official 2014 to 2016 CDC report by the International Infection Control Team of the CDC. The CDC also worked in coordination with the Food and Drug Administration, a federal agency of the United States of America, to create the adenovirus type 5 Ebola vaccine in accordance with the same source as we mentioned previously. The impacts of the CDC's efforts are seen when the WHO, who placed the regions of Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea under public health emergency of international concern status, was lifted on the 29th of March 2016. Liberia was first declared Ebola-free in May 2015. Sierra Leone announced it was Ebola-free on March 7, 2016. And Guinea was finally declared Ebola-free in June 2016, according to an official March 29 WHO report. Not only does this show the extent to which the CDC, a public health institute run and funded by the government, was able to successfully contain what was known as one of the worst epidemics of the 21st century, however, they were more effective than non-governmental organizations in improving the lives of displaced and disadvantaged people in the West African region due to a lack in economic stability. The rural and disadvantaged people of the West Africa were not able to afford basic healthcare necessities to combat these diseases, and an NGO cannot simply match with the resources, funding, and personnel that a government would have at their disposal, and therefore this negates the resolution that non-governmental organizations are more effective than governments in improving the lives of disadvantaged people. Thank you.
Next, we need to move to the podium and grab a microphone.
So I believe in your first contention, you mentioned vaccines. You have mentioned vaccines in your first contention. Could you state can you provide any statistics for beneficiaries from the vaccines?
Can you please restate your question?
You mentioned vaccines in your contention, in your first conservative speech. So, can you state any statistics for beneficiaries from the vaccines?
Honorable Judge, this question does not seem relevant to the argument, as the vaccine was created by the Food and Drug Administration with the CDC and was provided to various people in Ebola, victims of the Ebola outbreak. But the main argument was that the CDC had trained several other healthcare workers and established successful laboratories. You stated several statistics on child marriage. However, how do these statistics prove effectively that NGOs are more effective than governments in improving the lives of these victims and these disadvantaged people?
Well, my partner will talk about statistics specifically, but we can tell you that governments Without the NGOs lobbying for this legal act, the question would not have been raised. So, you were talking about specifically in, I believe, the last part of your first constructive speech about Ebola, the Ebola outbreak. Was there any NGO presence during that time frame?
Even if there was an NGO present, it would simply mean that NGOs and the government would then work in correlation together, and that would effectively negate the resolution that non-governmental organizations are more effective, because we've seen how effective the governments are. And so if there were an NGO present, it would mean that the governments and NGOs are as effective and equally effective. Would you agree that it would require a government and an NGO in order to bring about a legislative change in the child marriage policies?
Of course, but as I mentioned before, the question would not have been raised without the NGO lobbying for the legal act. Are there any follow-up questions?
Could you provide us with a statistic on the number of disadvantaged people according to your definition in the 2010 Haiti earthquake?
My partner will provide that in a second constructed speech. Any more follow-up questions?
No follow-up.
Judges, I'd like to take 30 seconds.
Okay, road 30 seconds.
Judges ready? Partner ready? For my second speech today, I will be reaffirming that NGOs are more effective than governments at improving the lives of disadvantaged people by bringing up two new contentions regarding around poverty and education, while also addressing our opponent's concerns during the crossfire. The fourth contention to our pro-speech is about poverty, specifically extreme poverty. The World Bank has defined extreme poverty as to be, quote, living on less than $1.90 US per day. In 2015, 10% of the world lives in extreme poverty, and while there has been a general decline in extreme poverty, some regions are yet to experience a significant decline. In fact, sub-Saharan Africa was one of the regions that actually experienced a growth in the number of extreme poor. The World Bank also states that the majority of global poor live in rural areas, are involved in the agricultural sector, and are under the age of 18. Over 70% of the population in Burundi, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Malawi, Madagascar, and other sub-Saharan African nations live on less than $1.90 per day, compared to the less than 1% of the people living in Iceland, Germany, Estonia, and other developed and financially competent nations. Yes, you can be disadvantaged if you live in a developed country, however, you are still far more enabled than one of your counterparts living in a developing nation. Our fifth contention for this case is education, and how the most disadvantaged people in terms of education are those living in developing nations who do not have access to quality or affordable government education. I bring this up to point out that in developed nations with financially sufficient government programs, such as in North America and in Europe, being poor and disadvantaged does not isolate you from education, as there are public school options. However, the vast majority of people do not live in such regions, and so on balance, education like this is not available. According to the World Population Review, this means that people living in these sub-Saharan African nations often have no free quality education and must pay money that they can't always afford to send their children to school. I'll also add that it is due to poor education that women and children are put in a position where they have many children, such as in the case of child marriage. It costs $350 for 1 year of elementary school in Malawi, $650 for a year of high school. Taking into account that the birth rate in Malawi is just over 4.5, we'll use 4 children in this specific household as an example. It costs a minimum of $1,400 US to send 4 children to school for 1 year. The GDP per capita in Malawi is $338. Education is simply not feasible. This is where an NGO such as World Vision comes in. As of 2017, World Vision had sponsored over 3 million children and operated in over 100 countries. Furthermore, every 60 seconds they provide a family with the means to alleviate poverty and give them the advantages they so need. Addressing a question my partner asked in the crossfire about how many beneficiaries there were for the vaccines that was created by the government. Yes, the government creating a vaccine is wonderful. However, by our definitions of improving the lives of disadvantaged people, simply creating a vaccine does not improve the lives of these people. The vaccine must be distributed and applied to these people. Because they can't provide us with any statistics on beneficiaries, to this point, their sole contention cannot stand. They also wanted us to address child marriage, and I'd like to point out that I have an article from The Guardian that says there was heavy government opposition to the legislation proposed by NGOs, a legislation that would only have been proposed by an NGO such as Girls Not Bride, who lobbies for the legal age of marriage to be raised. They also wanted some statistics about the number of disadvantaged people in the Haiti earthquake. So in terms of impact, 190,000 houses were destroyed, of which 105,000 were completely destroyed. Around 2 million people were internally displaced. As I said earlier, 250,000 people were injured. And as to the effects of the NGOs, World Vision in terms of disaster relief supplied over 20,000 medical kits, supplied clean water for people, and helped to rebuild infrastructure that the government needed. Thank you.
Can I be heard? Okay. Working in collaboration with NGOs negates this resolution as it doesn't prove that NGOs are better than governments. We believe that NGOs, in the case of legislative changes made regarding child marriages, NGOs wouldn't have been able to pass any changes without the power of governments, thus proving that NGOs do not have the mandate to make changes without working in collaboration with governments. They did not provide us with any evidence or responses as to whether the government also had an involvement in the Haitian earthquake. This leads us to believe and brews doubt in the Khan's mind whether there was actually any government involvement and whether governments and NGOs were working together in the case of the Haitian earthquake. In the case of extreme poverty, they had mentioned that more than half of the world's extreme poor lives in sub-Saharan Africa, but they didn't mention what NGOs did to alleviate the poverty or alleviate any of the economic burdens that were placed on these people. But just proving the number of people in these countries that were poor does not prove that NGOs were more effective than governments. In the case of education, where in the World Vision NGO example was stated, they did not mention where the money was come from and where the funding was coming from. Hence, and if they were funded by the government, which would mean that NGOs require the support of governments to operate. And stating that 3 million people had reached these people doesn't prove, $3 million had reached these people doesn't prove how these students were now able to go to school. And even if so, they did not provide any evidence as to how or whether this actually happened. This will now bring us to our next example by the Khan, stating that governments in partnership can work together to aid disadvantaged people in terms of economic fruition and the alleviation of poverty, leading to better healthcare and infrastructure. The Lao PDR is now a lower middle income country, and poverty has declined in recent years. This success can be credited to the Poverty Reduction Fund, aka the PRF, which was established to fight poverty at the grassroots level. It was designed to improve the access to village infrastructure and healthcare services. The current PRF project is primarily financed by the Swiss Agency for Developmental Cooperation, which is a federal administration of Switzerland and a part of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, created in support of the Swiss Constitution, which states that Switzerland must contribute to the alleviation of hardship and poverty in the world. As of a 2019 World Bank report, the PRF has achieved the following. Monthly household income in Lao PDR has increased from 75,000 LAK in 2012 to 650,000 in the early 2018. There's been a 36% increase in the number of households with the access to healthcare services and a 45% increase in those with access to improved educational facilities during the first 2 years. There's been a 48% increase in the number of households with the access to all-weather roads during the first 2 years. And more than 1,200 sub-projects were completed in 43 poorest districts of Lao PDR, including schools, rural roads, water supply, irrigation, and others. 92% of these complete projects were rated as being of high technical quality by the World Bank.
This thus proves that MEDCs, more economically developed countries, in cooperation with LEDCs, lower economically developed countries, can come together to help disadvantaged people. The contention of this argument is that NGOs are more effective than governments, but due to the examples provided by the con and due to the weak examples provided by the pro, we believe that NGOs are simply insufficient and unable to carry out any operations in countries without the support of the governments. And we believe that this thus negates the claim, proving that NGOs are not more effective than governments at improving the lives of disadvantaged people.
So despite the fact that the NGO World Vision is predominantly funded by people donating money, non-governments, if an NGO is funded by the government, how does that prove the government is more effective? Wouldn't you agree that a government funding an NGO acknowledges the fact that the NGO is more effective than anything the government could be doing? Why would the government fund an NGO if it's less effective than what the government could be using its own money for?
Because if an NGO is being funded by a government, it proves that NGOs are dependent on government funding, thus proving that NGOs must work in collaboration with the government to increase and improve the lives of disadvantaged people. What NGOs were present in Burundi or any places in sub-Saharan Africa, and what were their impacts?
So World Vision was present. I have a more complete list there if you'd like me to provide it with you later.
For the poverty part.
For poverty? We do not have any statistics on NGOs that were present. However, the failure of the government in these countries have failed, which is why the GDP per capita is so low. If the government was effective, it could have instituted policies in which to increase the GDP. Do you have any beneficiaries, any statistics on the number of people that were impacted by the housing?
Like poverty reduction?
Yes.
So we do not, but we have mentioned that the mean household income has increased from 75,000 to 650,000 LAK, which proves that this statistic has been taken on a general basis on the population of Lao PDR, proving that this was done on a general scale. So proving that there are lots of people who are living under poverty in sub-Saharan Africa doesn't prove that that NGOs are more effective than governments in improving the lives of disadvantaged people. So how does this affirm the resolution?
It affirms the resolution with examples we have regarding health and regarding education. World Vision also is present in sub-Saharan Africa. When you're educated, you are more able to take responsibility of your own finances and to improve your own lifestyle. So you said that on average the household GDP increased. Do you acknowledge the fact that this may account for the fact that some GDPs have decreased?
If an average has increased, we believe that on a general scale it has increased. So
there are still people who are potentially worse off due to these programs. Yes.
I mean, when averages are taken into consideration, yeah, there may be oddballs in which this is not true, but on a general scale, on balance, we believe that governments are more effective because this is what the on balance definition was termed as by the So stating that $3 million have reached these people by World Vision, how does this prove that these students were now able to go to school? How do we know the implementation of these $3 million exactly?
So it wasn't actually $3 million, it was 3 million students were provided for financially to be able to attend school. So that's the number of beneficiaries, not the number of dollars.
Our contentions that affirm the resolution of, on balance, non-governmental organizations are more effective than governments at improving the lives of disadvantaged people have been providing healthcare, particularly in Africa, where the disadvantaged are in far greater need of assistance, restoring and advocating for human and civil rights in poor and rural areas in South Asia, and finally, providing disaster relief, specifically in the infamous 2010 Haiti earthquake, where the government failed to do anything for 4 consecutive days, while our opponents have brought up the tensions of welfare and housing. Our arguments have clashed on the topics of specifically child marriage and welfare regarding the 2010 Haiti earthquake, and we have won due to the fact that the question would not have been raised without NGOs lobbying for this legal act. And we see no correlation between legislative power and effectiveness. So, and in regards to the Haitian earthquake, there have been 3 more natural disasters following the Haitian earthquake. In short, due to our points for providing, such as providing healthcare, advocating for human and civil rights, as well as providing disaster relief, and how we have won the points of clash, our case is most valid and the resolution is true. NGOs are more effective than governments at improving the lives of disadvantaged people. Thank you.
Honorable Judge, it is upon the pro with the burden of proof to prove that NGOs are in fact more efficient than the government at improving the lives of disadvantaged people. However, as the con, we can prove that either they are equally as efficient, or that governments are equally as efficient, or that governments are more efficient. Now, following up with this, Honorable Judge, simply proving that the government isn't effective at improving the income and GDP per capita does not prove that NGOs are more effective than the government. Even during Crossfire, when we asked them for NGOs in the sub-Saharan Africa that attempted to alleviate poverty, they did not specify any NGOs in sub-Saharan Africa. And so simply stating that the government cannot alleviate poverty doesn't mean that the NGOs could have done a better job at alleviating poverty, and providing statistics on poverty does not prove that NGOs are in fact more efficient than the government in this point. Secondly, they said that in the Haiti example, they said that the government did not do anything for 4 days. But how do we know, once again, I will ask this, they did not provide us with any evidence of whether or not the government stepped in after those 4 days. And they said that the Haiti earthquake did not last for only 4 days, but the aftermath of the earthquake could have been seen for many more days and months on end, which means that the government could have played a part. And if the government did play a part, it would mean that the government can work equally as effective as non-governmental organizations in attempts of disaster relief. Secondly, when talking about legislative change, they said that the question wouldn't have been raised without NGOs. However, we say that regardless of whether or not the question was raised, it is the governments that need to work in collaboration with these non-governmental organizations to bring about some sort of legislative change. It requires the NGO and the government to bring about a change. That means that governments will work equally as efficient as non-governmental organizations, regardless of whether or not the NGOs were lobbying during that time. It requires the government and NGOs to make a legislative change. And we believe that we have been able to prove that governments can be as effective as NGOs in improving the lives of disadvantaged people. Thank you.
We'll take 30 seconds.
Yeah, can we just stand up?
Well, the mic's working on the side. Can you move that mic up? Will you both come on and do it? Okay. Can we do that in a second? No, no.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah, we got that.
That's what I'm saying. Oh.
So, as we mentioned before, we believe that there is no correlation between legislative power and effectiveness, and you have mentioned that governments and NGOs need to work in collaboration. Yet, we have clearly provided a source that has said that governments were opposing the legal marriage age to be raised. So, how would you respond to that?
Regardless of whether or not the governments did oppose this, in the end we saw legislative change, which means that the government did make a legislative change. Their initial beliefs may have been different, but then we saw a change in beliefs, and that means that the government did make a legislative change, and they did use their power in coordinates with NGOs to bring about legislative change and improve the lives of disadvantaged.
If Haiti was a long-term disaster, then how does the government not responding for 4 days prove that on balance NGOs are more effective?
So I'm sure you know a person can go for a maximum of 3 days without water. And so because they went for 4 days, if no NGOs had stepped in, a lot of people would have died from dehydration, as because of the earthquake there was a lack of potable drinking water. In fact, due to the series of natural disasters that followed, a hurricane and another earthquake, a majority of the population of Haiti is still without water, and this is because the government has run out of funding, and the economic situation in Haiti is dire.
So, could you provide any statistics on the housing investment project, specifically for beneficiaries and results?
It's not a housing investment thing, but it is the poverty reduction fund. So we did mention in our speech that the monthly household income was increased from 75,000 LAK to 650,000 LAK in 2018, thus proving that the poverty reduction fund was successful in the case of the Lao PDR.
Our question was for how many people? Would you mind answering that?
No.
Okay, in these 4 days, do you have any statistics that prove how many NGOs stepped in during these 4 days to bring about change and impact the lives of disadvantaged people?
Yes, there were several NGOs, such as Habitat for Humanity UK, World Vision, and other NGOs that were also present. I don't have a full list, if you'll excuse me for that. During the distributions of the vaccinations for the Ebola outbreak, can you provide us with a point of comparison that says that the NGOs were completely ineffective or had no effect?
NGOs cannot create these vaccinations because they require FDA approval for these vaccinations, and we do not need to prove whether or not NGOs were less effective, but we just need to prove that NGOs and governments can be equally as effective, which would negate this resolution. Therefore, if the government did create this vaccine, regardless of an NGO's involvement or not, it's proving the efficiency of the government.
As was asked in the crossfire before, but not answered, can I continue?
Yeah, keep going.
A lot of people were affected by the 2010 Haitian earthquake, but what percentage of these people were actually disadvantaged according to your definition?
So our definition of disadvantage means lacking, I'll bring it up. It is disadvantage, unable to attain basic conditions such as civil rights, shelter, adequate education, and medical care. So due to the fact that almost 200,000 homes were completely destroyed, this falls under our category of disadvantage. Due to the fact that there was no adequate drinking water and medicine and medical supplies, which NGOs also provide, that falls under a disadvantage definition. While civil rights were not impeded upon in this specific instance, we believe that a large enough population of Haiti was disadvantaged because of this earthquake.
We'll take most of our time.
Okay, 20 minutes.
judges ready? In conclusion to our case, reaffirming the resolution that NGOs, on balance, are more effective than governments at improving the lives of disadvantaged people, I'd like to point out some flaws in our opponent's argument to begin. They said that one of their contentions was around poverty reduction. However, they did not provide a number of beneficiaries, and so we don't know how many people were affected. The sample size, the average household income did increase, but with no evidence on sample size, we don't know how many people were affected, so we cannot take this into consideration. Secondly, they said that there was a distinct correlation between government involvement and NGOs, and that the governments ultimately have a mandate to pass laws. While this is true, I'd like to reaffirm the fact that without the NGOs, the government would not have brought this up and the government would not have passed this law. Yes, in the end they did pass this law, but again, if they didn't start having this process to pass the law, then nothing would have happened. Also regarding legislative power when it comes to child marriage, in India, which is in South Asia, where over 70 million child marriages occur yearly, or not yearly, will occur between 2013 and 2020. There were over 1,500 cases of arrests due to child marriage. However, the government only took less than 300 people and actually put them in jail because of their child marriage accusations. Despite the fact that there are such a large number of child marriages, we see that the government is unable or unwilling to act on this, proving that legislative power does not necessarily guarantee an improvement for the lives of disadvantaged people. Our points revolving around healthcare, particularly for sub-Saharan Africa, stands because of the statistics we've proven, we've stated. On child marriage stands because we've proven that the correlation between legislative power and improving the lives of disadvantaged people is not necessarily true. And we've proved that in the earthquake in Nepal, enough people were disadvantaged and were helped by NGOs where governments did not step in and in a timely manner. And we've also proven that NGOs are more effective in addressing education in Africa because our opposition failed to refute this claim. Thank you.
As mentioned before, working in collaboration with NGOs negates the resolution, as it does not prove that NGOs are better than governments. We believe that NGOs, in this case of legislative changes made regarding child marriages, NGOs would not have been able to pass any changes without the power of the government. It does not matter that they brought up the question, but it does matter that the governments were the ones to enforce it. They did not rebut the contention that the CDC managed to train healthcare workers and create state-of-the-art laboratories in countries in which healthcare facilities were at a bare minimum, proving that there was an improvement, which thus proves that there was an improvement of healthcare services, which is according to their definition of disadvantage. Secondly, we prove the efficacy of the CDC because Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea are now declared Ebola-free due to the sole involvement of the government-funded CDC. They did not provide us with NGOs that impacted the lives of disadvantaged people in terms of the alleviation of poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. And proving that governments were ineffective in sub-Saharan Africa does not prove the resolution which states that NGOs are more effective at improving the lives of disadvantaged, even though with them lies the burden of proof. They did not tell us that the 3 million children in sub-Saharan Africa were now put to education with the involvement of the World Vision and what funding was used to put them to this. Now, the Con would just like to conclude the two arguments made by them, which were that governments are more effective in handling disease prevention and eradication for the disadvantaged than NGOs. According to their definitions, people who lack in basic healthcare services are ones that are disadvantaged. We believe that the CDC, with their ability to eradicate Ebola in these countries in sub-Saharan Africa, were successful in improving the lives of disadvantaged people. Furthermore, we believe that governments in partnership can work together to aid the disadvantaged in terms of economic fruition, which leads to the better access of healthcare and infrastructure. And this was proved in our example of the Lao PDR and the Poverty Reduction Fund, in which mean household income was increased, access to healthcare and education was increased. And thus, we believe that we have successfully negated this resolution. Thank you.